my screen. Let's see, go. Okay. Is that working? We can see everything. Where did you all go? Perfect. Okay, great. So hi, my name is Dr. Lilian Ardell. I am the founder and lead everything. It's a small shop of Language Matters. That's my educational consulting firm. Important that you know that I was a rank and file dual language teacher for about 10 years in New York and went and got a doctorate in bilingual education. And I started studying sort of the focus of like sociolinguistics, language and society. And I really drilled down on teacher attitudes and beliefs about language. So this presentation I'll be giving today, it's called Disrupting the Monolingual Bias, Advocacy and Teacher Empowerment During Turbulent Political Times. And y'all, I gave that title before the election results this season. So we are definitely in turbulent political times. We know that there are members of our school community that voted against our immigrant and English learner students' best interests and their families. And so I think that this talk is deeply timely. And I am going to make it interactive and ask you some questions. And I hope that some of the insights I share today resonate with you. There'll be opportunities to download a resource that I have and check me out on social media. And hopefully I can partner with some of your schools and communities for some linguistic justice coaching, which is what I am best known for. So without further ado, I'm going to get into it. Let's get started. It was early October in an elementary school in South Brooklyn, and the school was gearing up to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. And I was there conducting my research with Zoraida, an exemplary ESL teacher who kindly allowed me to observe her best practices with her Ls. And on that October afternoon, something bizarre happened. You see, Susan, a monolingual teacher in the building, was quickly and quite aggressively approaching us, and Zoraida shot me a quick glance and braced herself as Susan arrives, catching her breath. And she says, Zoraida, I'm so glad I caught you. Listen, Hispanic Heritage Month is next week, and I feel stressed about adding anything to the main curriculum. I mean, my English learners are so far behind. Well, you know this because you're their teacher. And the administration tells us we've got to center our Latina students, which, like, I mean, I totally want to do, but I don't know how. And you're the most Spanish person I know. So I thought maybe you could give me some tips. Do you have any ideas? Zoraida is calm but firm with her response. And she says, Hi, Susan. You've got fifth graders, right? Have you ever heard of the Chicana poet and author Sandra Cisneros? Yeah, she's got these beautiful essays about identity and belonging. You can give your students, including your English learners, some of her essays, and they can read them and discuss them in like literature circles, and maybe they can write their own essays about identity and belonging. Cool. That would be a great way to center your students' cultures and languages during this month. National Lewis, what do you think of Zoraida's response? Tell me in the chat. What do you think about how she handled that question? What do you think? How did Zoraida do? I love it, Jay. She gave the monolingual teacher an opportunity to learn something new and grow her knowledge about Latinx communities. Hmm. Professionally, a way that students could benefit. Zoraida was completely poised and professional. A simple and effective idea. Okay. So I was standing there and I'm like, oh my gosh, Zoraida, that's like culturally, linguistically sustaining. Like, good on you. I could not have answered the question better myself. Right? Like it was a linguistically sustaining pedagogical response. Like clearly she has been to a master's program, she has read all of the literature, and she know what to tell Susan. So that's what I heard. That's what you heard. This is what Susan heard. Wait, Cisneros with an S or a C? Oh, Cisneros. Bingo. She has a picture book. Second grade. Perfect. Yeah, I'm just going to give them a read aloud and I'll give them some coloring activity. It's about like hair, pelitos or something. Susan, that's nice. You think that they can read essays, but they cannot. I mean, like I said, they're so far behind. I think that a picture book is much better suited for my L's. Thank you so much. I do not know what the school would do without you. And off she goes, which leaves Zoraida and I standing there. And Zoraida looks down, confused and frustrated. Truly, like nothing of what she just said actually landed in Susan's brain. Like Susan has this algorithm of low expectations. And really, what she wanted from Zoraida was some Latino's author's name. Something like this, like find a Latino author, picture book, coloring activity, voila, Hispanic heritage modification checked off the to-do list. Now, I'm guessing some of you relate to Zoraida in this moment. And if you do, I'd like you to tell me in the chat how you think she feels. I'm listening. I'm looking for some emotions. How does Zoraida feel in this instance? Okay, I'm seeing sad. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jenny. Frustrated, defeated, deeply confused, taken aback, annoyed. Certainly, I felt annoyed. Not valued. Lost for words. Appalled. Yes. Oh, Natalie wonders if she's feeling like she doesn't belong in that school. Upset, disconnected. Okay. So I asked Zoraida, and this is her verbatim response. Lilian, the monolingual teachers always see my L's through a deficit lens. They're always complaining about they're never enough. They're far behind. None of them think they can rise to an academic challenge. And then when they ask me for advice and I give them culturally sustaining advice, they completely ignore me and misconstrue it. And I advocate for them. Your students are capable, trust me. But year after year, I'm just like, what's the point? Am I even affecting change in this building? I remember this moment like it was yesterday. And the more I've played it out in my head, the more I continue to return to the factors in our educational system that condition Susan to say these things and think this way about her students. Now, look, I'm not here to disparage Susan. She's doing her best, I think, working in a low status and a low paying job in this country. But still, it doesn't give her the right to dunk on her English learners in such a blatant and obvious way. And it certainly doesn't give her the right to hound Zoraida to make up for her pedagogical deficits and then to completely ignore her. Something in this equation is not working. And something is contaminating the way our teachers think about their multilingual learners. Which leads me to share this parable. There are two fish swimming in the water, going about their lives, when suddenly this elder fish swims up alongside them and turns to them and smiles and says, "Hey, boys, how's the water?" And he smiles a little fishy smile and then saunters off. And then after a moment, the younger fish turns to his buddy and thinks about it and goes, "What the hell is water?" So look, I'm not here to play the role of the wise old fish, but I am here to help you see the water. What we live in, our culture, our society, our context, it's so invisible, and yet it's so powerful. And see, it's our job to peel back that veil of invisibility so that we can see and problematize its contaminants. Because only when we see what's wrong can we hope to fix what's wrong. And in this case, the water is educational policy, and the contaminant is the monolingual bias, a set of toxic ideologies about language that promotes this narrative. Our English learners must acquire academic English at all costs while assimilating to mainstream US culture. Let me make this point again. The monolingual bias is about beliefs and attitudes about our English learners and about language that promotes a narrative that academic English proficiency is going to get these kids more assimilated to US culture. Now, don't misunderstand me. I want our Ls to acquire a strong, robust English. It's one of the ways that they are going to thrive in this country. I never want their English development to come at the cost of access to their culture or their identity. So to disrupt the bias, we must become fierce advocates in our roles as bilingual and ESL teachers. That's what this talk is about today. And if you see this slide, that's a teacher. That is a teacher wearing a MAGA hat, okay? So what is it? The call is coming from inside the building. Like, these are the people that we are working with, and we need to somehow find a way to advocate to our students amidst that. But see, here's the problem. No one really properly trains you on how to do advocacy in schools, do they? Throughout this talk, you're going to hear me refer to a concept called endurance advocacy. And in order to understand more about our roots as advocates, I want to review a brief history of how our field came to be. So in my 20 years in the language teaching field, donning various roles as rank and file dual language teacher, applied linguistic, doctoral student, a coach, and now a consultant, I have met many language teachers, and every time I ask them, why this? Why bilingual education? They always give me the same response. Fue una llamada. It was a calling. And I love that, because when you zoom out a bit, you'll notice other pieces of the bilingual teaching tapestry fall into place. Civil rights issues of the 60s meant that some important court cases were fought on the grounds of linguistic justice for immigrant families. There's the Bilingual Education Act, and y'all know the 1974 Supreme Court case Lau versus Nichols, which requires schools to provide English instruction to emergent bilinguals because our nation's highest court determined that language access is a civil right. So put it simply, y'all, bilingual education is a social justice issue. And advocacy, it's in our DNA. So we have it inside of us. Well, we need to figure out how to get it out there and to be more effective advocates. And so among these freedom finders is a scholar from the 90s, and she advanced the educational conversation by giving us a new framework to see inequalities in ways both big and small. Enter the queen, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. Dr. Ladson-Billings, y'all have heard of her because she plucked critical race theory from legal scholarship to better interpret her data on school children in the 90s. And in one of her earliest articles on this topic, she asks this question. Just what is critical race theory, and what's it doing in a nice field like education? Provocative. See, Dr. Ladson-Billings is a boomer. She has observed firsthand national perceptions of teachers move away from the 1950s school mark. Listen, back then education was nice. Like get home at 3 p.m., make supper for the kids, fix a little cocktail for the mister. Niceness does not signal making a fuss or rocking the boat. But fast forward several years to the 1990s social consciousness movement. And you'll find programs like, I don't know, Teach for America, selling bright, young, college educated youth on the promise that they could enter education as a direct pathway for social change. And since then, education, broadly speaking, has undergone a massive sociopolitical change. A certain demographic of the American population is taking notice and opting out of public education. In a recent poll from the Washington Post and George Mason University, it shows that nearly 50% of homeschool families believe local schools are imbued with liberal viewpoints. How dare they? Cue those town hall meetings about banned books. It is all a part of this steady backlash to keep educators in line around hot button issues like equity and diversity. So I ask you, what is a conversation about the monolingual bias doing in a nice field like bilingual education? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But first, I would like us to read a transcript from scholar Dr. Geneva Smitherman, her research in 1977. And in it, we're going to hear from Miss Jones, a white middle-aged woman, interrupt a story as told to her by her Black first grade student, Bernadette. And I use this transcript to illustrate a few points about language ideologies and the slipperiness through which they emerge in everyday classroom interactions. And as you listen, I ask you to consider how Mrs. Jones' beliefs about language impact Bernadette's willingness to tell her story. Ms. Jones, you remember that show you told us about? Well, me and my mama and them? I'm sorry, Bernadette, start again. But I can't understand you. Well, it was that show, and it was me and my mama. Sorry, I still can't understand you. Now, Bernadette, first of all, it's Mrs. Jones, not Ms. Jones. And you know it was an exhibit, not a show. Now, haven't I explained to the class over and over again that when you are talking about that you always put yourself last when you are talking about a group of people and yourself doing something? So therefore, you should say what? My mommy and me? No, no. Bernadette, no. It's my mother and I. Now start again. This time, right. It's okay. It wasn't nothing. Real data from a real classroom conversation between a first grade teacher and her student. So let's unpack Mrs. Jones' beliefs and see how her attitudes about language impact Bernadette's development. In 2015, Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores developed a helpful sociolinguistic concept that maps colorism onto teacher perceptions of how Black and Brown students speak. And they call it the white listening subject, and it goes a little something like this. Teachers who overly scrutinize any dialects or versions of a language that deviate from the standard is an act of linguistic profiling, and it leads to disastrous outcomes for BIPOC students. See, in the example above, Bernadette was using very legitimate practices of her Black speech. But since her speech didn't correspond to the standard, Miss Jones interrupts her 3 times, claiming, I'm sorry, I don't understand you. Bernadette's speech is stigmatized, and Miss Jones, the white listening subject, believes it's her calling to sanitize Bernadette's speech. See, Susan and Miss Jones, two well-meaning teachers doing the best they can, don't realize they are listening to their Black and brown students through a warped filter. And it is sociolinguistic concepts like the white listening subject that can help us see how ineffective language-focused PDs can be if they ignore teacher beliefs and attitudes about language. The monolingual bias harms Black students like Bernadette, and it leads Susan to reduce Zoraida's thoughtful response to a limiting coloring activity. Like I said, something in this equation isn't working, and something is contaminating the way teachers think about their multilingual learners, which brings me to the central theme of today's talk. The monolingual bias promotes the harmful narrative that multilingual learners must acquire academic English at all costs. Costs to their heritage language, to their identity, to their humanity. And while the pursuit of academic English for ELs may seem like a noble cause, the paradox of assimilation makes high-quality educational outcomes for this population of learner nearly impossible to achieve. We must work together to disrupt it, and disruptions of all shapes and kinds are what I offer you in this talk. So let's see. I'm going to go to this one. Okay. So anybody in the chat, I want you to answer this. Did you know that over 75% of our nation's multilingual learners are taught in English-only classrooms, including newcomers? And what is the single most reported hack a monolingual teacher uses when supporting these students? What do? Answer in the chat. Tabitha was right on top of it. Google bleeping translate. All right, here's my hot take. Would you be surprised if translating for newcomers is one more way that the monolingual bias rears its ugly head? Let me explain to you why. The bias conditions teachers to assume that translating is the best and only option for a newcomer. And it's rooted in what I call a one language solution mindset. One language solution, such that any matter pertaining to a newcomer, you just have to unlock the language barrier and boom, comprehension resolved. Jenny's saying it's not only accurate. Hello, what about culture? What about all these other aspects of communication that cannot be directly translated? Because the bias conditions us to see language as nothing more than a set of interlocking words that carry meaning. And with the touch of a translation button, we've convinced ourselves we have solved the acute problem. Except that translating is a temporary fix for a much broader set of interlocking inequalities plaguing our bilinguals. I like to refer to what the OG monolingual bias disruptor, Dr. Kathy Escamilla, said. Translating for our newcomers is the easy thing to do. It isn't the equitable thing to do. Hell yeah, Kathy. So I want to offer you 3 ways that you can disrupt the bias when it comes to translating for newcomers. These are things that you can bring directly to your monolingual colleagues. Here's the first. Create language scaffolded activities to socialize your newcomers as members of your classroom. Establish a buddy system for the child and possibly one for their parents. And acknowledge that language and cultural integration takes time. Draft a mantra and turn it into a class slogan. So you're thinking, Lilian, okay, how do these things disrupt the bias? Well, first, they decenter a one language solution mindset. And next, you prove to your students, as well as yourself, that metalinguistic approaches are your best bet for building long-term pathways to academic success. And finally, you address the transformation to your class ecology by prioritizing your newcomers' needs for safety and belonging. I'll drive this last point home with a quote from Toni Morrison. People won't remember what you said. They'll remember how you made them feel. And speaking of feelings, we're going to pull up a TikTok from one of my favorite accounts, Trayvon Manning, and he calls it Operation Best First Day Ever. Let's give it a listen.
So look, I get a new student tomorrow from Guatemala. Like so new, she's only been in the States 21 days. So Operation Best First Day Ever is in full effect. Like I want her to have the best first day ever in the history of first day evers. And how do I do that? Usually we get donuts in the morning for breakfast. We're gonna make some slime. We're gonna watch a movie and have some snacks. And we're gonna do a lot of fun things, and that's a fact. Come on. And she don't speak no English, but that's okay because love don't need translation. Come on, somebody. Love don't need translation. If that's one thing I know how to do is that's give love, show love, and make these kids feel love. So we're gonna make her feel remarkably, iconically, ironically special on her very first day. So special, she ain't gonna never want to go away. You feel me? So it's up, it's stuck, and we ain't never coming down. I can't wait for tomorrow, but we're gonna run this town. We up. Blessings.
Hey, Vaughn. Yes. So, okay. We talked about buddy system. We talked about, I know, I love it. I love this post too. That's Trayvon Manning. You can find it November 6th, 23. If you want to pull up the video and just share it around, it is so good. And yeah, how loved must this little girl have felt? I mean, maybe she got the wrong idea that school is just a party every day, but even still, like, he didn't fret over her understanding, over her academics. It was a cause to celebration. He thought about how she would feel. And he signaled to the other kids in the classroom, we're going to welcome this little girl to be a part of what we do here. So beautiful. So to return to this point, the monolingual bias promotes a narrative of urgent assimilation, with English dominance as proof of making it in the US. Oh, hold on, sorry. And this means our collective efforts to support our multilingual learners using asset-based pedagogies, like so many of you already do, will always conflict with this biased framework. And while we live to and work to sustain the legacy of the OG bias disruptors who came before us, we need to figure out sustainable ways to engage in endurance advocacy. Because then and only then can we step into our poder colectivo to become the kinds of role models and heroes our students so deeply deserve. So, in my workshop on this topic, I asked teachers to draft a recipe to disrupt the monolingual bias. And together we generate a word bank and they create charts with measurements and pinches of this and that. And then we conclude with a recipe share. Oh, you can almost smell the zest of perseverance and the vapors of victory. So I'm not going to gatekeep it from you. Here is my recipe to disrupt the monolingual bias. To start, you will need to reflect on and question your existing relationships to languages. Have any of you internalized beliefs, say that the standard is inherently superior, beliefs that might be warping your judgment? The recipe continues with 1 part tenacity and 3 parts acknowledging that frustration and disappointment are bound to arise. Remember in our opening story, Zoraida was deeply frustrated. She needs to have some tenacity to be able to push through and to survive another day. The recipe continues with 3 parts: curiosity towards sociolinguistic theories of language and learning. Well, who among you, National Lewis, will launch your own lunch and learns to grow your knowledge base? And lastly, add 2 parts belief that you are someone who deserves to be heard, followed by a lifetime of gratitude for your specific journey to becoming bilingual. So at this point, I actually have a freebie that includes my recipe to disrupt the monolingual bias. And it's a packet, there's the definition of it, and there's a bunch of other things in there. So I'm going to throw in the chat the link for getting that download. So here it is. You can go ahead and click on that link and you should be able to get that download of the recipe to disrupt the bias. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. And I believe you're going to have to check your email to confirm that you got the email sent to you, and then it'll get sent right to you to download it. You're so welcome, Williams and Sabrina and Maria. Cool. All right, I'm going to keep going, but that link is there for you. All right, so let's review for a moment. We've heard several stories of the bias, from Susan's rejection of Zoraida's thoughtful advice to Miss Jones interrupting Bernadette's story 3 times. From the aching reality that ENL teachers are not properly trained on how to become lifelong advocates for ELs. I return to this premise that language education is rooted in social justice. So what are we to do then? Working in a nice field like education, when your inner voice says, don't rock the boat, or, yeah, but this is a job with benefits, Lilian. I'm not going to be the one to get fired. You know what you do? You build up your resistance capital. Based on the theorizing of Tara Yasso, a Latina scholar who draws on critical race theory for the Latino community, resistance capital is a form of community cultural wealth developed from a legacy of Latinos fighting back against whatever current forms of oppression they may have faced. If you're familiar with Paulo Freire's work, then you know what this is. See, look, oppressed groups can fall into one of 2 mindsets, that of a victim or of a human with agency. I am somewhat allergic to victimhood. When I made the tough call to divorce my ex and strike out his life as a single mom, it was my human spirit, it was my agency that propelled me ever forward. I defied the patriarchal and religious systems that kept me staying in a loveless and harmful marriage. And how did I push myself to make that impossible choice? I thought about my 6-month-old daughter and I said, what type of role model do you deserve to have as your mother? So I ask you, what type of role model do you wish to be for your students? Think back to who your role models were when you were growing up. Did they model victimhood or agency? Let's do a quick analysis of this word capital. It's a metaphor for wealth. It's a resource that requires investing in, filling up. It's something that can get depleted if left unattended. And we can fill our resistance capital by engaging in doable disruptions to the monolingual bias. Let me give you a few more. Set boundaries with colleagues around translating duties. Number 2, go have that hard conversation about equity practices with your team. You know, that hard conversation that you've been avoiding somehow, but you know you really need to have. Here's one. Swap out those quick fix social media accounts for ones that inform you on sociolinguistics and language ideologies. Go check me out at Language Matters for those of you that are on Instagram. I am dropping tiles and reels all the time that talks expressly about advocacy and teacher empowerment. I do not promise you any quick fixes because this is not turn the page and people think differently tomorrow work. This is rigorous, sustained advocacy work. And that is the movement that I am building at Language Matters. See, your resistance capital requires weekly doses of language knowledge and space to reflect. The shifts will start small and humble, but they will nurture something so beautiful and sacred inside you. So, one of my favorite thought exercises is to replace our event and to see how it could go differently. So I'll close this talk by replaying that opening encounter between Susan and Zoraida to illustrate a doable disruption to the monolingual bias. Diddloo, 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 diddloo. Okay, so where were we? Recall that Susan arrives complaining about Hispanic heritage and my L's are so far behind, and at which point in this version, I introduce myself. Hi there, I'm Dr. Lilian Ardell, a bilingual ed scholar. And I shoot a quick glance to Zoraida to say, let me take a crack at this. And she's like, by all means, Lilian. And then get a little twinkle in my eye. And I grab my phone and I hand it to both of the teachers. And in it, I share with them a quote from my favorite Chicana author, who else? Sandra Cisneros. And these are moments where she describes her bilingual writing practices that are filled with humor and playfulness and, let's be honest, a little disruption. Cisneros says, as a bilingual speaker, I try to make the reader aware of language practices, so I play with literal translations from Spanish to English. Like, how funny do these characters sound? Tío Gordo, or Uncle Fatface, or Tia Blanca, Auntie Light-Skinned. And I do this so that the English speaker will feel startled, and the Spanish reader will clock it as familiar. Cisneros continues. For those of us living at the borderlands, you can see the opposite country in a way that that country cannot really see itself. A goal of my work is to present mirrors to each country, to ourselves, and to the citizens of the world that have never been held up before. And then I watch as the truth of Cisneros' provocative genius washes over them. Susan looks downright perplexed, and I think I know why. See, I took an opportunity to nudge her towards a pedagogy of high expectations by exposing her to what a multi-award-winning Chicana author thinks about when she thinks about language and literacy. I was prompting Susan to use her imagination to see her L's as authoring their own bilingual playful essays on language and culture. But I was doing something else, wasn't I? I was attempting to disrupt the monolingual bias that formed a tension between these two teachers just moments ago. And I did this by covertly asking Susan to notice the water and to do something to decontaminate it. Now, I want to make this point very clear. This was not Zoraida's responsibility for why there was a tension there. This was Susan's job to do some unlearning and some real reflection. So a disruption to the bias is not about you, language and ESL teachers, learning more. It's about helping the others around you see how contaminated the water is and generate some curiosity within them. Now, whether Susan will take my advice and begin to see herself as equity-minded teacher who can transform her own attitudes about language, well, that's up to her. And what I hope to model for Zoraida, as I do for all bilingual and ESL teachers with whom I work, is to turn to the OG monolingual bias disruptors in your culture and in your community to go embody their resistance capital as you forge your own courageous moments. Be them in webinars like this one right now, or more likely in humble hallway interactions at the end of the day. So I ask you, when and where will your next doable disruption moment be? May it be swift, empowering, and so deeply healing. Thank you, National Lewis. So it is 6:45 on the dot. And I would like to open up the chat for some questions that I can hopefully answer for you. Or if there's any comments that you'd like to make about something that is resonating with you that you are going to continue to think about, I want to hear from you.
Lillian, thank you so much. Before we start the questions, I just want to make a quick announcement. In the chat, I'm going to put the exit ticket. So for any teachers, if you would like to earn PD credit, just make sure you fill out the exit ticket. Thank you so much, Lillian. I want to say so much, but I will let the participants speak first.
Sure, yeah.
All right, so let
Okay.
me.
So yeah, let's see. William's already threw a question in the chat. What do we do with teachers who don't speak Spanish? They have newcomers and are using Google Translate. What happens to them and to those, what happens to those students? Okay. Dr. Ofelia Garcia and all of the translanguaging people, one of the very first things that they ever said is you do not need to be multilingual in order to support newcomers. It's one of the biggest lies that the monolingual bias trains people to think. Remember, if you only know one language, then you just assume that everything needs to be delivered to you in your language. That's the one language solution mindset that I was describing. So